I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined once again by Patrick Wyman, and today we are going to be talking about training camps. That's the topic of the week. Before we do that, because I didn't get a chance to thank people last week, I want to thank a few people who pledged to Heavy Hands on Patreon in the month of February. These people are Angel Jambazov, Jake Christina, Mark Guagenti, Matt Giordano, Ricky, Henry Protzman, and Ben Cohn. Thank you very much, guys, for supporting us. Anybody who pledges $5 or more to the show gets a little personal thank you on the air, and we really do appreciate your support. I just want to say before we begin our discussion that Pat and I are both very excited. On next week's episode, we will be having a brief interview with probably the best color commentator in the business, we've decided, the man with the brilliant calls and the superhero jaw, Brian Stan. And he's going to be on the show to talk about fight analysis and big fights coming up and his history as a Marine and as a fighter. So we're really looking forward to that. Hopefully it should be fun. I think a lot of people in the MMA community have an affinity for Brian Stan. I think people...
I don't see how you couldn't. I don't think there's a better color commentator going in MMA right now.
Yeah, an agreeable personality, an affable kind of guy, and very good at what he does, more so than most in the business. So we're looking forward to that. But we thought today... Next week, we've got, or this week, I suppose, this weekend, I don't even know when it is, because it's so not worth dedicating a whole show to. There is a UFC Brisbane show. It is secretly a pretty fun-looking card in terms of matchups. The lineup is not bad. There are a few fights in this card that I actually expect to be really fun. I think Mark Adiva versus Dan Hooker will be a lot of fun. I think Beck Rawlings versus Seo Hee Ham will be a blast. I think Ross Pearson versus Chad Laprise is a really fun fight. Obviously, Frank Mir versus Mark Hunt. Somebody's going to get their head blown off. You got Jake Matthews, and there's a lot of interesting matchups in the card, but not a lot of name value. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is absolutely fair to say.
It's pretty much completely devoid of name value, in fact. It's just, and we're not just in the business of being interested in name value, but in the same way, it's name value is a signifier of narrative strength. There's not a lot of compelling narrative going into this card. It's just a kind of thing.
This isn't one of those cards that people are going to look back on in 6 months and be like, oh man, do you remember that awesome UFC Brisbane card where this narrative that we'd been working on for months came to fruition?
Yes.
And this other one got started, and no, this is a fight night. It's not going to be a bad way to spend your Saturday evening. You're going to walk away entertained by what you saw. It's well matched. There's enough to keep all but casual fans interested. But there just is not a whole lot of lead up to it. A lot of tension going in.
If the fights of 2016 are a movie in mid production, then UFC Brisbane probably gets left on the cutting room floor. Most likely. It's probably a scene that gets cut out of the final. It's director's cut. If you're a big fan, you'll love it. But otherwise... So not to just disparage the card, we are going to do a little bit of a brief smorgasbord of fights at the end of the show. We should come up with a theme, fight smorgasbord, for any time we decide to do like a rapid-fire round of quick fight analysis. Oh, somebody do that. Somebody listening.
I think our theme here is this shit is fun. This shit's gonna be real fun.
It'll be fun. We need like an intro theme though, like a little sting of some kind. Somebody out there, if you can incorporate the word smorgasbord into a brief set of lyrics, then I will.
Oh, I mean you mean like a musical theme?
Yeah,
I thought you meant like a thematic theme for this.
No, I threw you off by discussing like the creation of a film and narrative, and now I'm going somewhere completely else. I would love to have. So anybody out there with a little bit of musical talent, I would love to have another brief piece of music or sound effects to awkwardly discuss for 30 seconds before letting it play. That would really be a brilliant addition to the show. Sit alongside that wonderful heavy bag theme that we have. But anyway, we've already probably devoted more time to UFC Brisbane than we ever intended to in the beginning part of the show, because it's not a massively compelling card in a lot of ways. We decided that this would be the perfect week to do a little bit of an off-topic topic, a non-schedule related topic. A few people have already asked. We did our Styles Make Fight series way back. We've done a few. Obviously, with the UFC schedule, we often feel compelled to talk about whatever the big event coming up is. We've got some really big events right around the corner, but a few people have requested that we just do kind of another topic episode sometime soon, and we thought this would be a perfect chance. And this one is sort of tangentially related to a lot of recent and upcoming events, but not directly tied to anything. It's just a topic that we've been wanting to discuss for a little while. So today we're going to be talking about MMA teams, training camps, sparring partners, training partners, coaches, trainers. We're going to kind of talk about a lot of the, what may be misconceptions, a lot of the general ideas in this sport about how a training camp is conducted or should be conducted, and maybe try to get at the heart of what the best way to conduct a training camp is. So we're going to talk about a lot of top fighters' preparation, the different ways that they prepare, and we wanted to start off, Pat, by even just trying to define what a team or a camp is.
Yeah, so I think that this is the single biggest misconception that fans have about the structure of MMA teams and training camps. And that's that if you're a King's MMA fighter or a Jackson's fighter or an ATT fighter, that means that you do your training under that roof. You're always with the same group of training partners, that these camps are in some way, shape, or form cohesive. When really that's not the case. These are loose associations of people. Some of them are more cohesive than others. Like AKA is much more cohesive than King's is much more cohesive than say ATT is. Sarah Longo is really a pretty loose association. Like there's a core group of guys who are there, but like in all of these cases, it's not that you do all of your training under that one roof. You might go you might go to Sarah Longo to do your MMA training and your MMA sparring, but you go another place to do your jiu-jitsu. You may go into the city to go to Renzo Gracie's to do your jiu-jitsu. You may go do some kickboxing training a couple of days a week out at Belmore Kickboxing Academy.
Or if you're doing really well, you might bring in coaches and training partners from those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, King's is the situation that I know best. So I'll use a situation like we'll take Rafael dos Anjos as an example, the prototypical Rafael Cordero fighter. Well, Rafael dos Anjos does his wrestling training with a coach named Jacob Harmon at the Church Boys Wrestling Club, one of the better club wrestling teams in Southern California. But the coach that he's most associated with is Roberto Gordo Correa, a really well-regarded jiu-jitsu black belt, and Dos Anjos has been with him for, I think, 10 or 12 years. Mm-hmm. But then, on top of all that, Dos Anjos goes to Singapore from time to time and does some work at Evolve. So there we have three different facilities that he's at regularly with three different coaches and a fourth that he's at occasionally. And that's a fighter where we think we know really well that he's a Rafael Cordero guy. So the situation is complicated. These are loose associations, loose networks of fighters that tend to cluster around camps as nodes. Like picture fighters as little dots clustering into bigger clusters of dots.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing there is, and obviously as you mentioned and alluded to, that there's a spectrum there. Even a place like King's is a lot more condensed than a place like Black House, or maybe Elevation, which is kind of a model that we may see more of as the sport goes on. But I think the interesting thing is that the way that fighters cluster around a camp, that relationship can change the more powerful and influential and wealthy a fighter becomes, to the point where those fighters will become nodes that other fighters will cluster around. They will kind of, and I think that is the direction we're probably headed in as this sport develops. That's kind of the way boxing works, right? In MMA, it's a very MMA, despite what we just said about how loose all this is, MMA, I think, still has a very team-oriented culture. I think the culture of MMA is very oriented around the idea of having teams, having teammates. Teammates don't fight each other, and teammates are often fellow elite fighters, often in the same division, because they want to train with people around their size. But That's not the way that it is in boxing, right? In boxing, top fighters don't train with top fighters. Very, very rarely. And you'll maybe see Floyd Mayweather has some journeymen training with him, some solid fighters, but Ashley Theophane is never going to contend for the belts that Floyd Mayweather holds. You know what I mean? Or held, now that he's retired. So I think, was there a chuckle there, Pat?
Yeah, a little bit.
You don't think he's retired?
No, I don't think so. I think
really?
we'll see him out there again.
Maybe. Hard to walk away. But the point I'm making is that I think in the future we will see young fighters vying to go to camps in order to get experience with good fighters, rather than good fighters trying to go to places where there are already other good fighters. Because that's how it is in boxing. You have the opportunity to go and work. If you're an up-and-coming fighter, you will be happy to go and work with a great fighter to spar, to prepare them for a fight, because that means you get valuable experience working with a great fighter, and you can bring your own coach along with you, and he can guide you through the sparring sessions. It's kind of like a separate mini camp for you. And the thing with that is, you don't get the sense in MMA that sparring partner is really a job, and it's definitely a job in boxing. In the same way that there are a lot more professional opponents in boxing, people who come in to lose or to give sort of a stiff challenge to a young prospect as he's coming up, you have guys in boxing who come in and they earn their money by preparing better fighters, ones more cut out for the sport, preparing them for their upcoming fights. You don't see that a lot in MMA, I don't think. I don't think even at like Kings, you probably don't have a lot of paid sparring partners. Most sparring partners are probably part of the team, you know?
You see it for big-name fighters who are running their own camps. You do see some paid sparring partners.
Sure.
So I know that when Fabricio fought Alistair Overeem the second time, they brought in kickboxers to work with him. They brought in international kickboxers to work with him. I know when BJ Penn was getting ready to fight Frankie Edgar the last time, he paid to bring in some sparring partners. I think he brought in he paid Mike Dolce, and Mike Dolce brought in sparring partners. I know he brought in Mirsad Bektic. I think maybe Nick Lentz was there too, and then I think there was maybe one more guy. So it is a phenomenon that exists to some extent in MMA, but not nearly to the same degree that it does in boxing.
Stephen Thompson is kind of he's maybe the new model, right? For a while, he was going around and being that sparring partner and getting experience himself. He prepared Chris Weidman for his shot at Anderson Silva, a notion a lot of people laughed at the time, but it's really not a bad idea. You bring in someone with a similar kind of style. Or did he prepare him from Machida, or was it Silva? I thought it was Silva.
I think he worked with him for both of those.
Okay, yeah, which makes sense, right? He can emulate both of those styles to an extent. And they had him taunting Chris Weidman and stuff while fighting him and trying to embarrass him to get him prepared for the mind games. But now Stephen Thompson, having his own camps and having earned his own reputation and being a top fighter himself, I recall for the lead-in to the Hendricks fight that he was flying in wrestlers and people to prepare him. He basically had a camp built around himself. He just still did do some traveling around, but he was paying people to come in and spar with him or roll with him or wrestle with him.
Yeah, and so this gets at the underlying reasons why MMA is structured the way that it is, why MMA has teams in the first place. So I think that there are basically two reasons for this. The first is that, especially earlier on in MMA, the financial resources were not available for fighters to build camps around themselves, to build full-service camps with everything that they needed. Because to prepare yourself for a fight against an elite opponent in MMA, you need more than one coach, right? You can't just have your head coach and then you bring in sparring partners the way that you would in boxing. You need more. And even boxing camps these days are becoming much bigger outfits. You've got your strength and conditioning coach. Got
even just the rec center that I go to box at, it has a conditioning coach and a head coach and a couple of other coaches with their own specialties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but MMA is even more. You need even more coaching knowledge to be able to run a good camp. You need a wrestling coach. You need a jiu-jitsu coach. You need a striking coach. You need a head coach to top it all off. You probably need a nutritionist. You need a strength and conditioning coach. You need all of these things. And especially in the early days of MMA, there's no way that any one fighter could afford that. You had to pool your resources to do it. If you had a whole camp full of top fighters making reasonable money by the standards of the day, then you could afford to have all those things together. You could afford to have a strength and conditioning coach. You could afford to have your wrestling coach. You could afford to bring in your striking coach. Miletich was kind of a pioneer in that. But so you could afford to have all those things under one roof. And so in some ways, the structure of team is built into MMA in a way that it wasn't in, say, boxing. But then the other underlying reason for that is the specialization that you have to have. It's unlikely that your striking coach is going to know enough about wrestling to be a functional wrestling coach for you either.
I think it is that. I think there is definitely there's a financial demand that you have to join together in teams to be able to afford to have all these different coaches. You have a lot of coaches, which is almost a team in and of itself, as you mentioned. I think also that because of the different backgrounds of MMA compared to boxing, there is a little bit more of a team ethos built into it. I think in the same way that I think a lot of I take issue with a lot of the ways that striking is taught to MMA novices because it's often taught in a class setting. And even good coaches, like I think Rafael Cordero, you probably had Muay Thai classes at Verdum's gym, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so a lot of kickboxing and boxing, Muay Thai, stuff like that, is taught in a class setting, which is not at all the way that you would be taught to box. You will have a group, but you will have your individual drills, and you will have your individual sparring sessions, and you will have individual guidance in most places, even as part of a team. And it's the same with Muay Thai in Thailand. You still have a team, but it's a lot more individual because with striking you can, but I think it's probably best not to just have a whole classroom of people all live sparring on the mat and moving around freely, which is very, very, very common in MMA. You see it a lot. And I think the reason we see that is because that's how jiu-jitsu and wrestling are taught. It's a lot safer to have a ton of people rolling at once and to just roll with someone, move on to your next partner and roll. You get a ton of different experiences, and they're gentle arts compared to striking. And so I think that in the same way, the sort of team-oriented aspect of jiu-jitsu and wrestling, where it's a kind of a class setting, probably has an impact on the way that MMA is perceived by the people who participate in it. That they feel that it is a thing where teams grow and learn together, and not an individual pursuit where you look out for yourself and you get what's best for your own personal development at all times.
Yeah, and I think that there are both positives and negatives to that kind of team atmosphere in
Sure.
MMA especially when it comes to sparring, to build off what you were talking about there. Because I think that the Vale Tudo culture, when we're talking about Brazilian gyms and Brazilian coaches, has an influence in that as well. So like coming up through Verdum's and training under guys who were trained by Rafael Cordero, you go into spar and it's a rotating thing. You're in there and you do one round with one person,
round robin
the next person. Yeah, and like that is designed to inculcate mental toughness as much as it is to teach you anything.
Yeah.
Like that, we had a lot of really, really brutal days where by the end of it you're just trying to survive and get your wind back for between rounds. Like that, you're not actually learning. I don't
think boxing it does, but I think traditionally boxing does not have the same kind of sparring as conditioning mentality. And that is definitely something you can afford to do relatively safely in jiu-jitsu and wrestling.
Absolutely.
Is not nearly as safe in striking. When the more tired you get, the more likely you are to be injured, and the more shots you're going to take, the more damage you end up accumulating. You get really, really tired in jiu-jitsu. Yes, you can run into a knee or get a concussion. It's a combat sport, so it's not safe. But, in most cases, you end up getting your guard passed more easily and you tap more frequently. It's not as dangerous,
Yeah, I think back to the times when I had like actual serious injuries in sparring sessions, and it was always at the end of kind of a rough day like that.
Sure,
yeah. When I dislocated my kneecap, when I got kneed in the face and concussed, like when I ate a head kick, things like that. It was always at the end of those sessions.
Sure.
And like that doesn't mean that there's no lesson there, that you don't learn anything from that, but it's also an inherently more risky practice.
Sure, and it's not as if fighters who have camps built around them don't have that kind of thing. You will absolutely have fighters who will have round robin or as they call Shark Tank sparring to prepare for a fight, where the toughest part of the camp will be 1.5 weeks out from the fight, and you'll be in there for 5-minute rounds or more, and you'll have a fresh partner each round, and they are being told to go after you to prepare you for the difficulty of fighting. In the same way that when we had Tyron Woodley on this show, he talked about going to AKA, and we will definitely be talking about AKA more as the show goes on. he talked about going to AKA for that experience, to mentally toughen him for the fight ahead. And so that's obviously a valuable thing, but a lot of gyms, I think, have a sort of class environment, a team environment when it comes to sparring all the time. And it's just different from the way that that things are conducted in boxing. And it's not as if boxing has everything on lock, and that's honest, always the best way to go. But there's some interesting nuance here. So why don't we wrap this segment up, and when we come back, I want to talk more about the importance of training partners and sparring partners, how different conglomerations of training partners can influence your preparation for a fight, if iron really does sharpen iron, and how that process actually works. So short break, and we will come back with that. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. So, before the break, I mentioned training partners, iron sharpening iron. That is the phrase that is most often tossed around when it comes to elite fighters training with other elite fighters. And I think the best example of that, Pat, is probably AKA, who we have already mentioned a couple times. AKA has, well, who's at AKA right now? We got Daniel Cormier, we got Cain Velasquez, we have Luke Rockhold. Those are all the big guys. We have part-time Khabib Nurmagomedov. We used to have
Islam Makhachev is there. Ruslan Magomedov spends time there. Who else? Oh God, a lot of guys. Shuttle in and out.
And used to be John Fitch, and was Josh Koscheck AKA as well?
Oh, for a long time he was. Mike Swick was. Josh Thompson, I think, is still there.
Yes, Josh Thompson, of course. A lot of big names is the point. A lot of elite fighters. Pretty much everyone on that list was or still is a top 5 fighter, other than, I guess, Ruslan Magomedov, and he may very well be headed there. So it's a lot of big names. And that has often been touted by the members of AKA as the recipe for their success, that iron sharpens iron. Elite fighters have to train with elite fighters. Now, obviously, that isn't a hard rule. That's not always the case, because there are plenty of elite fighters who train with no one of note.
But that's not really true. Like, there are a few elite fighters who train with no one of note, but by and large, if you are a successful elite fighter in MMA, you train under well-known coaches with excellent training partners. Like, go through. Let's go through.
I'm not. The thing is, no. I don't ever. I would never try to intimate that they don't train with good training partners or with good coaches. I'm talking about training specifically with other top 5 or top 10 fighters in their divisions, which is the AKA approach.
Yeah, no, I'm not I'm not exaggerating. Go look at the top 15 of any division and point out how many fighters don't train with other elite fighters.
Okay, well, I'm thinking of champions. We got Demetrius Johnson. We have Ioana Jędrzejczyk. We have. Does Dominic Cruz train with any top bantamweights right now?
He trains with a lot of top guys at Alliance and has for a very long time.
He's got Jeremy Stevens as a major training partner. Sure.
He had Johnny Case, Miles Jury. A whole collection of other UFC level talent.
Okay.
Got a lot of guys who transferred in and out.
Sure, okay, that's fair. Demetrius Johnson's the real outlier then. I guess you want to Jędrzejczyk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Rafael Dos Anjos, Robbie Lawler, Luke Rockhold, Daniel Cormier, Fabricio Verdum, Ioana Jędrzejczyk, who is currently at Jackson's, Misha Tate, who's at Extreme
I don't know that
Couture.
she is at Jackson's. I think she was in Albuquerque decided to stop by.
She was getting some training.
She also trained with Ludwig and Dillashaw.
But contrast that. So Claudia Gadelha, if we go down the list, Holly Holm. Gadelha, Nova União fighter, Holm, a Jackson's fighter, Cain Velasquez, an AKA fighter, John Jones, Jackson's, Weidman, Sarah Longo. At welterweight, Rory McDonald is a TriStar guy. Eddie Alvarez has trained with the Black Zillions and with Frankie Edgar's crew. Jose Aldo is a Nova União guy. Dillashaw at Elevation, and prior to that at Alpha Male. Joseph Benavidez is at Alpha Male. It is a rare fighter in MMA who does not train in that kind of environment.
Okay, that's a good point. So it is overwhelmingly the MMA approach. I still think that gyms like AKA and Team Alpha Male, until recently, they used to have a lot more elite fighters there, and Alliance, teams like that stand out, I guess, being places where like top 5 and top 10 fighters collect to train with each other. I think like there are obviously like John Jones has good training partners. Doesn't really have any top light heavyweights that I know of. Trains with a few good heavyweights. He's got Arlovsky and Mir and guys like that. But I think largely John Jones's camp is built around his trainers working with him and him probably working with specific disciplines and specific training partners who are not necessarily top fighters, right?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think if you're restricting it to guys in your weight class, then yeah, that's a much more restricted sense. But I don't know. I mean, I would define any of these as fighters being surrounded by a collection of other high level talent, whether that's specifically within your division or not.
Okay, so do you think that is the best approach?
Do I think that that's the best approach? No, I think that that's the default approach in MMA, but I think that there's a lot more variation than the description that we just gave actually gives it. And this was something that we were getting at in the opening segment there, but okay, so John Jones is at Jackson's, but he does his own strength and conditioning stuff. He has his own private sessions with Mike Winklejohn and Brandon Gibson and with Greg Jackson standing over his shoulder, watching him work with one or two guys. But then, of course, you also have group classes now, and that's kind of like, so you can be at a place like Jackson's or AK. I think to a lesser extent in AKA, which I think is still really group focused, but you can be at Jackson's or ATT or TriStar and get a lot of personalized attention if you're a big name fighter.
You definitely get the sense from AKA that it's like your training camp is just a lot of team practices. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like you're showing up, Daniel Cormier is going to show up and work with Velasquez and Rockhold every day for his John Jones preparation, most likely, you know?
Yeah, and so they'll bring in training partners too, like Cormier brought in Haji Murat Gatsalov to work with him before he fought John Jones.
Sure, okay.
So guys will bring in training partners, and I would assume some sparring partners too. Like those guys are not dumb, but at the same time, it is a much more team focused environment.
Yeah. So my thought is obviously training partners matter a great deal. And having good training partners is very, very important. We could very well title this episode, "Who Do You Train With, Motherfucker?" Because that is what Nate Diaz said to Conor McGregor leading up to their fight. Diaz brothers obviously very proud of their training camps, the vast variety of disciplines with which they train, and the top competitors from various disciplines they train with. Conor McGregor's camp is very much built around himself specifically, and is not the same kind of team environment. Even as an SBG fighter, he has his own camp going on, very, very definitely. And so I'm wondering what iron sharpens iron really means, because if I have a knife, I said this before we recorded, but I think it's a great metaphor, so I'm just going to repeat it. If I have a knife, and I have a very nice knife in my kitchen. I like to cook, so I got a nice knife. And every time I use my knife, I clean it, and I wipe it down, I dry it, and I hone it. Now, if I were to hone this knife by rubbing it against another knife of the same grade of metal, I could probably do something to it. I would definitely probably make marks on it. I would influence the knife, but would I actually be keeping it at its optimal sharpness? In fact, I have to take the knife and choose a specific grade of metal in a honing rod to get the kind of edge on it that I want, or to keep it straight and to keep it from bending and folding and changing its sharpness. I have to train my knife with a different kind of material, ceramic or steel or whatever, in order to get the best out of it. And I think that fighters are probably very similar in that this kind of approach often leads fighters to just think, I'm training with top fighters, that's what I need. And how valuable is it, for example, for Cain Velasquez to be doing his sparring with Daniel Cormier and Luke Rockhold when he is preparing for Fabricio Verdum or preparing for Junior Dos Santos?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I'm of two minds about this. I think on the one hand, MMA is increasingly becoming a sport where at the highest level you train for specific opponents. right? Like
Yeah.
you may have a baseline curriculum, and so like if you talk to Firas Sahabi about what he's training on a daily basis, there is a curriculum that he
Sure.
teaches in group classes, right? And he evaluates every one of his fighters, and Greg Jackson does the same thing, and Rafael Cordero does the same thing, where they evaluate their guys on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, a month-to-month basis, in terms of where they are in the general progression of basic skills that everybody needs to have. But then your fight camp is when you work on specific things for specific opponents with specific sparring partners and specific regimens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, and at the highest level, that's what MMA is increasingly being driven toward. And that's what a camp like AKA may not necessarily be perfectly suited for that if everything is going to be group focused, and if you're sparring especially is going to be that kind of round robin, we'll throw you in there with the toughest guys in the world and see how you come out on the other end. Like, but on the flip side of that, with so many opponent cancellations, changes at the last minute, all of that stuff, is it necessarily the best thing to be hyper focused on one opponent?
Well, I think if that were the case, then it would probably be in your best interest to just wait for your original opponent and not accept a very short notice replacement.
But the incentive structures of MMA are built around incentivizing those kinds of short notice fights too. Like we just saw with Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor. Like I think McGregor was probably very focused on fighting Rafael dos Anjos.
Oh, yeah, I don't doubt it.
Yeah, and so when he agreed to fight Nate Diaz on short notice, there were a lot of things that he had been working on that probably didn't translate real well. But at the same time, there are a lot of financial incentives, in his case, probably 12 to 15 million of them, to stay in that fight. So,
sure, and for other fighters, probably even more so. I think McGregor probably would have been fine if he waited another 2 months for his 12 to 15 million. But for a guy who is making 30,000 a show, obviously the incentive to take a short notice fight is much more. Because relatively speaking, he doesn't have a large backlog of money to fall back on and wait. You got to get paid. So in a sport, and I think that is, again, I think finance, money is really probably a key part of this discussion of why the environment at MMA is the way it is now. And I think it'll take more McGregors and Joneses and Rouseys to bring more money into the sport and to bring more money to the fighters specifically to change the way that MMA is trained. Because I don't think I think you're right. I think a lot of fighters probably value the sort of variety experience they get by doing team practice for a large part of their camp and training with their team and not doing specific preparation.
Yeah, so I'm. It's kind of a weird spot to be in because the structures of MMA are what they are. There's a place for needing to do that kind of round robin training, that kind of team training. But at the same time, there's increasingly a space for you to build for fighters who are making a lot of money. I'm surprised he hasn't come up in our discussion thus far, but Michael Bisping, I think, is the perfect example of this.
Yeah.
His camp is completely built around him.
Yeah.
And so,
who does Michael Bisping spar with? I'd be interested to know.
Oh man, he's brought in a lot of guys. He sparred quite a bit with Lorenz Larkin. He's brought in a lot of dudes at various points to work with him.
But even then, like you bring in Lorenz Larkin, you almost certainly pay him to spar. I would hope Lorenz got paid for that, and probably that was for the Anderson Silva fight, I imagine.
And a couple before that too.
Okay, sure. So you bring the guy in, you pay him, and you're not necessarily bringing in Lorenz Larkin because he's a top fighter or representative of the elite in your division, but rather because he poses a specific kind of threat that you want to be ready to deal with in a live sparring environment.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not building a team and saying, okay, Lorenz Larkin is good, we want him on the team. It's not necessarily because he's good, it's because he's good for what you need. He's appropriate. I think appropriate is probably what drives boxing camps more than good. Because a great example here is Deshaun Johnson, who people probably don't even remember. He, as an MMA fighter, went through Explode Fight Series, the pitiable organization that has soccer moms getting knocked out every other weekend on the local Indian reservation. And Deshaun Johnson blew a few people out of the water in Explode, which I believe Explode Fight Series is a MMA promotion in 2015 that still allowed shoes to be worn during fights. So very much a different era and a different way of promoting the sport. But Deshaun Johnson comes into the UFC. He had a couple of game performances, but he basically washed out. I think he had 3 losses and he was gone. And that was what made his name notable when it was discovered that in preparation for Mayweather-Pacquiao, Manny Pacquiao had brought in Deshaun Johnson to prepare him for Floyd Mayweather. And a lot of MMA fans laughed at this when it was reported because obviously Deshaun Johnson can't be that good. Even if you look at his BoxRec record, it's not great. I can bring it up now and remind myself what it is. But it's a journeyman's record at best. He's obviously not among the best in the world at what he does. Let's see. As a professional fighter, his record's 19-18-3. So it's barely a 50-50 record. Barely a winning record. But if you look at Deshaun Johnson's record and the names on it, it's kind of a who's who of solid fighters around welterweight. He's not frequently knocked out, so he's hanging in there and showing that he's tough, which is a very valuable trait for a sparring partner, especially if you kind of just need someone to beat up on. And I think Freddie Roach came out and said, oh yeah, Deshaun Johnson, he's well known for being a good sparring partner. And some guys are much, much better in the gym than they are in the ring. Without the pressure and just in there knowing that they're going in there to get paid and do work, they feel relaxed and they do well. And so that's obviously very different even than bringing in a guy like Lorenz Larkin. Because Lorenz Larkin is among the elite as far as MMA is concerned, while Deshaun Johnson is not close to being among the elite in terms of boxing.
Yeah. So I think that there's going to be an increasing place for this in MMA in the next few years.
Sure.
Like, I think as the paydays get bigger, and presumably they will, like we're already seeing guys like Daniel Cormier and obviously John Jones, Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, fighters at the upper end of the spectrum getting paid more. I think that there's going to be at some point a sort of a trickle-down effect, and there will be more fighters who can do what Michael Bisping does and have basically their own camp focused
even just
them.
By fighting the guys who were getting paid more. Nate Diaz had the biggest payday of his career by fighting Conor McGregor, who I believe was getting the biggest payday up front in UFC history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so yeah, but I think that as that kind of money gets bigger for more fighters at the top, there's going to be more opportunities for that. Mm-hmm. But with that said, I do think, like, we've been kind of hard on camps like AKA and what have you in the course of our discussion here, right? In some cases, rightfully so. AKA's injury rate speaks for itself, as does ATT's and a few other places. But with that said, they serve a really important purpose. And I think that for young fighters especially, they teach you how to be a professional, because that's not a given. You know, this isn't baseball where you spend 4 years riding buses in the minor leagues before you get into the majors, and you've had to learn to guard yourself in dingy hotels and shitty bars along the way. Mm-hmm. Like you have a period in the minor leagues in baseball where you learn to be a professional. For better or worse, college basketball and college football serve as professionalism factories, and then you have good processes once you get into the NFL. You have a team environment to keep you on the straight and narrow and teach you what it means to show up and do your job every day. That's not the case in MMA. You have somebody who comes out of a college wrestling team and shows up at a gym. Like, they have no idea what it takes to be a professional fighter. You may not know how nutrition works at the highest level. You may not know how weight cutting works at the highest level, especially if you're not somebody who comes out of a college wrestling background. You're just an athletic, talented kid. Like, you need to be around professionals to learn what that looks like. And the trickle down effects from being around those professionals are huge for young fighters. Like, guys like Verdum hand out T-shirts. They hand out extra gear that they get from their sponsors. They hand out supplements that they get from their sponsors. Like, they can hook you up with better coaches. They bring you around to work drills with them. Like, the benefits to young fighters from being in that kind of environment are immeasurable. And even if later in your career you go off on your own, those kinds of elite training camps are where you learn the things that you need to be successful as a professional fighter.
So here's a question. Do you think it would change if, say, there was pankration in the Olympics or some kind of largely popular and largely competitive amateur MMA system? Amateur MMA is kind of a joke right now. In most contexts, it's basically just a way. Promoters view amateur MMA as a way for them to get free fights on the card, and there's not a lot of structure in terms of how competitions are organized. There's not a lot of relevant titles. There's not a lot of just not a lot of structure to how amateur MMA works, and so it is not an ideal environment unless you have a really good coach or a really good manager who knows how to work it for you. Like Justin Gaethje has a pretty prominent amateur record. He took a few fights to prepare himself. A couple guys have notable records like that. But unless you have some kind of outside guidance, it's not ideal for developing you and basically taking your lumps as an amateur to prepare yourself for the realities of professional fighting in the way that amateur boxing is.
Yeah, I think amateur MMA is getting better, especially in places like Las Vegas and California. New Jersey too is getting a much better amateur system. In places where there is regulation of amateur MMA, it's becoming more of a viable system.
Sure.
And in the next few years, I think we'll see more fighters come up through amateur systems and become professionals. But for now, for the most part, amateur is not a viable preparatory path. And even fighters who are fighting as amateurs are a lot of the time training with pro teams.
Sure, and many of them, I would say, but just a guess, so I could be wrong, but I would say the majority of them are not starting amateur MMA from the time that they are children. In the way that boxers do. They are also coming from the wrestling programs. They are also coming from other environments, from jiu-jitsu or whatever, and then coming to compete in MMA and starting off an amateur to dip their toes in. But they're not going in there as 10-year-olds and learning to do MMA.
Yeah, and the difference between an accomplished jiu-jitsu competitor who's used to that kind of environment and, which is, again, still largely group classes, even if you're getting private lessons and even if you're doing like high-level training with really good partners in preparation for your tournaments, the difference between that and the environment of a room full of professional fighters is enormous. It's an enormous difference. And there's no better way to learn to be a professional fighter than to surround yourself with them, because it matters both in terms of your skill development, but even more so your social development, learning the right questions to ask, learning to watch other professionals is how you learn about the sport, I think.
Yeah, I would be really interested to talk to Elliot Marshall about this, because Elliot Marshall is a guy who I think has one leg in both sides of this issue. One foot in both sides, both different camps, because he is one of the head coaches at Elevation, right? He works with TJ Dillashaw, I know. And so he works with Elevation, which is kind of a fighter-focused camp thing, where Elevation's more like Black House, where I don't think it's a very structured team thing. Fighters, of course, they'll work with the top fighters, but it's more along the lines of what Michael Bisping is doing, having camps built around the fighters. That's why Dillashaw went there. But Marshall's also a grudge trainer, and grudge is definitely team focused, more so than the others, right? I know who are grudge fighters right now, Gaethje and Nama Yunus, although they are definitely what's that?
Still Nate Marquardt.
Marquardt, that's right. Okay, so they definitely are just big fighters without a ton of training partners, but I think it is definitely more of a team practice kind of thing at grudge compared to Elevation, maybe. Just a guess here.
That sounds right to me.
Lucy in the background there. Do you, Pat, have a plan to make Lucy the next Bailey of the MMA community?
I don't think that I have a plan, but I will say she does well on social media.
Should Julie Kedzie be worried of having her dog usurped? I imagine you as kind of a pageant mom, where you're just trying to cultivate a certain personality for Lucy to live vicariously through her.
Yeah, well, she definitely has her own little world, and I just want to make sure that she gets the recognition that she deserves. That's all that I want.
Yeah, she deserves it. She's a pretty dog, damn it. So
exactly.
Okay, well, on that note, why don't we wrap up this discussion? It's been fun to talk about, and I hope you guys at home all enjoyed that. In our next segment, we are going to talk a little bit of the fight smorgasbord. Still waiting for that sound effect. Wouldn't it be amazing if by the time I mentioned it, someone had already created one, and we come in next segment with a sound effect ready to go? It's not going to happen. We're going to talk about a few of the fights that interest us on a personal level, maybe not strong enough to base a show around, but certainly strong enough to deserve watching at UFC Brisbane. So that after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. All right, so to wrap things up, let's have a little bit of a fight smorgasbord here. We have, as we said at the start of the show, at the top of the show, that's radio speak, right? We have a lot of really interesting looking matchups here, ones that should play out in a very interesting fashion. Just not a lot of ones that have... These are all subplot fights. There is no major plot that would invest you in this fight card if you weren't a hardcore fan like the nerdy gentlemen hosting this show are. So to start our rundown, we're going to try and do 2, 3, 4 minutes max on a few of these fights, maybe devote a little more time to the ones that are really interesting. Pat, what are your feelings on Ren Nakai?
I don't want to talk about Ren Nakai.
It's the same tone every time you say it. I don't want to talk about Ren Nakai. So we're gonna.
I just think it's such a weird phenomenon. I want nothing to do with it. It makes me feel physically filthy,
like ants on your skin. I had a lot of fun creeping Pat out by posting Ren Nakai photos to him.
Oh, stop!
And if you know what I mean when I say Ren Nakai photos, that's a phrase that has a special meaning. So
stop it.
Yeah, uncomfortable material. So skipping past that. We're going to talk about Dan Hooker and Mark Ediva. Or do you want to talk about Ross Pearson, Chad Laprise first?
Let's talk about Pearson Laprise first.
Okay. Quick rundown of this fight. Fun matchup. The McGregor effect is in effect because both of these guys have, even though both of them are lightweights, elected to fight at welterweight because they're both short notice replacements. Have you heard about this?
Yeah. Well, but they were both scheduled to fight on this card at lightweight, and they agreed mutually just to not cut weight.
Yeah, they were like, I don't feel like it. Which is interesting, and I like it. It sounds like a fun deal to not have to cut weight. You had your change-up. I mean, why not? Why make your training camp any more difficult when you have to change opponents a week and a half out? And just go ahead and cut the weight cutting out so you can focus all your energies in adapting.
Yeah, I fully support that. So who do you think wins this fight, Connor?
Boy, I think Chad Laprise, but I think it's because Ross Pearson is such a matchup-specific fighter. I think... Chad Laprise, I've said this before, but I think he is kind of the ideal for us as a hobby striker. He basically, his style, it uses everything that Faraz has always really advocated. He's very footwork dependent. He throws good straight punches. He enters on angles and exits on different angles. He's just really reliant on that sort of lateral angular movement and finding opportunities off of it. And he moves well, and he doesn't sell out to go for finishes. He's just a very good, consistent striker. And I think because he is so good as a counterpuncher and an outfighter, I think he's going to frustrate Pearson because I think consistently throughout his career we've seen Pearson struggle. Wrestlers have troubled him, and Laprise isn't going to do that, but we have seen him struggle more when he has to come forward. He's a very good counter fighter. He's good when fighters engage him in the pocket, but Trinaldo had the best success, as I predicted that he would, when he hung back. Paul Felder failed because he came forward. Evan Dunham boxed him from distance. Sam Stout did not. Al Iaquinta didn't, but Al Iaquinta is just a whole nother level in terms of that kind of striking. So I think if Laprise hangs back, makes Pearson create the exchanges, and counters him, that he can win a close and fairly hard-fought decision.
Yeah, also, Pearson's a bit of a slow starter, and Laprise is a very fast starter. So it's easy to see Pearson finding his range and his timing in the third round, already down 2 rounds.
And because of the lack of a weight cut, you have to imagine that Laprise's past issues with stamina won't be as present.
Yeah, and those were, it was weird that he had issues with stamina, but because he's got great cardio, generally speaking, but Brian Barberena just works at a crazy pace, and he's a very attritive kind of fighter.
Is a crescendo fighter. He really gets stronger as the fight goes on.
Yeah, exactly. I'm interested in your comments about Laprise as a hobby fighter, because he was like that even before he started training under Zahabi. He came to Zahabi with skill sets that Zahabi knew how to use, and he's only gotten better with it. I'm not inclined to read too much into the Trinaldo fight for him. But that was kind of a standard prospect doing well, gets clocked by a big shot, and then kind of falls apart.
And made a bad decision after he got clocked. Yeah, he's like, I'll pull guard to recover. Yeah,
yeah, and he got beaten down by a guy who actually has a really underrated top game. And has dynamite in his hands. But yeah, I like Laprise in this one. Also, with Pearson, it's kind of hard to tell where he's at, man. He's so inconsistent from fight to fight. And yeah, it's matchup dependent, but sometimes it just seems to be, where is his head at and what was his camp like? Yeah. It's kind of hard to tell with him.
Yeah, I say matchup dependent, but he's not so much match dependent like I don't know, like Holly Holm is. He just seems to be inconsistent in a lot of ways. I think he has kind of comfortably settled back into his role as a gatekeeper. When he had that run between the Soteropoulos KO leading up to the Gray Maynard KO, he had the Melvin Gillard no contest that wasn't really going his way. But then the Diego Sanchez robbery, he seemed to be on a run of basically 5 solid or unremarkable performances. But I think he has resettled into his role as just a guy who tests prospects now that he's basically traded wins and losses in his last 5 fights. And I think he's perfectly suited in that role for Chad Laprise. Even though this is a short notice matchup, I quite like this fight for that reason.
Yeah, it's a good fight. So next up, Hooker Adiva. This is way flying under the radar. Neither guy has anything resembling name value. But
yeah, there's no reason that you should really know about these guys. But it is, as a matchup, it's probably going to be a blast.
Yeah, it's really fun. Like, Hooker, nice, good rangy striker, especially when he works from southpaw. I like him a lot better in southpaw than in orthodox. Really fun clinch game, great elbows, great knees in tight. Ediva, really explosive and athletic dude. Great kicking arsenal. Throws a lot of unorthodox and unusual things. Really has a really potent side kick that he likes to throw.
Has a Sanda background, I believe.
Yeah, he's a Wushu Sanda guy. He fights out of Team La K, if memory serves.
Which has a few solid, a Filipino team that has a few solid MMA fighters over in 1FC.
Yeah, Honorio Bonario being probably the highest profile one of those guys.
Sure.
He's a really fun fighter, and I think that Hooker probably takes it because he's just a little bit longer. He's got a little bit of an advantage in volume, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Like, Ediva is a really fun striker. He throws everything real hard. Got a lot of power and a really nice kind of unexpected takedown game to go with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. A very solid, well-rounded mixed martial artist. Kind of slow, tall guy who fights in mid-range and in close, and does not have the defense to do that safely. So he definitely gets tagged. But man, if you remember his fight with Maximo Blanco, Blanco was on top form in that fight. Really, really good in terms of volume and consistency. And Hooker, had it been a 5-round fight, Hooker would have won. Blanco expended every bit of his gas tank beating the hell out of Hooker, and it just wore him out. And Hooker suffered a vicious cut and all of this concussive damage and just kept coming. So if he's not defensively viable, he is at least tough enough to make his preferred range happen in most fights. I thought he was really off in that Yair Rodriguez fight. I do recognize that I probably shouldn't have picked him going into that fight regardless, but it was kind of weird. I wonder if it was maybe indicative of some kind of change he's trying to make. He's still a fairly young fighter, but he came into that fight and fought the entire bout as a southpaw and didn't really seem to apply any pressure.
Well, I think Rodriguez is a really confusing fighter, and we talked before. Hooker is not the head kick knockout of Hatu Hioki aside. Hooker isn't super comfortable from long range.
Yeah, he's a mid-range fighter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that Rodriguez spent the entire fight playing a really interesting outfighting game.
Why the southpaw though?
I think because he wanted to accentuate. I don't fucking know. Actually,
that's weird,
I had a
right?
thought there, and I think it was a dumb thought.
he's not a stance switcher. He's always orthodox as a fighter. So I just don't know.
No, he fought Hioki from southpaw.
Did he?
A bunch of that fight against Hioki was southpaw.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm misremembering.
Yeah, I actually think he's better at long range from southpaw.
Maybe that's why.
I think he's better in mid range and diving into the clinch from orthodox.
Maybe he adjusts it based on the size of his opponent and what range he expects to be to fight at.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Oh, yeah, that was my thought on southpaw. It wasn't actually that stupid.
No, that's a good thought. That's a good thought. I forgot about the Hioki fight. And he fought Blanco, a much smaller man who he closed the distance against from orthodox. So
exactly. So I think he was just confused by Rodriguez's range, and I think he was really shocked that when it got into the clinch, Rodriguez was the stronger and better fighter there. I think he expected to have the advantage in the pocket and in the clinch, and it turned out that Rodriguez was just way more athletic and had a really great arsenal of trips and throws that he could hit in tight, and so Hooker could never get his elbows going.
Yeah, and then even compare the way that Hooker reacted to Rodriguez on the ground in that leg lock tie-up, that leg entanglement, compared to the Ian Entwistle fight. It was obviously just a very different level of submission grappling from Rodriguez.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Hooker probably takes it, but it's going to be real fun.
I think it's one of those fights where Hooker very likely loses the first round, where he gets going and has a razor close second round, and then dominantly wins the third. I think Adiva is a sneakily good kickboxer, but I think it will kind of look similar to his Kevin Souza fight, where he gets into a few too many exchanges with a guy who is just too durable to do that with, and gets tied up and battered with knees as the fight wears on.
That sounds about right. So, Beck Rawlings versus Siohi Ham. I'm a big Hamderlei Silva fan. How about you, Connor?
I love this fight, and I love Hamderlei Silva. Weirdly enough, Hamderlei Silva is the nickname you would expect to come from the more aggressive fighter, but that is not Siohi Ham in this matchup. Beck Rawlings is like all aggression to a fault. You know what I mean? I think Beck Rawlings is a kind of fighter where she, especially in an exchange or in a clinch, she does not know how to pass an opening by. She sees an opening and she goes for it. If it's a weird head and arm throw, if it's an elbow, no matter what it is, if it means off-balancing herself, no matter how risky the opening, if it means off-balancing herself or opening herself up to a submission or giving up her back, she will attack it. And I think that will ultimately be her downfall against Ham, who, while she is definitely comfortable in a brawl like Vanderlei Silva, she is much more of a tactical, a strategically minded fighter who tends to avoid her opponent's strengths when she can.
Yeah, I like Siohi Ham in this just because I think the level of striking skill is so far in her favor.
Yeah.
I think she's just a better fighter all around. Like, I like Rawlings' aggressiveness, but I just don't think from a technical perspective she's all that accomplished.
And I think she is too aggressive. As I say, I think she's far too aggressive for her own good.
Yeah, whereas Ham is a very clean, measured, durable, above all else, very durable kickboxer with a lot to offer there. So I think the depth of skill just goes so far in Ham's direction that despite the fact that she's really a natural atom weight, she's not really a straw weight. I think the size disadvantage matters a whole lot less than the far advantage in skill.
I did want to bring that up though, because Ham is very small for this division. She has been tiny compared to both of her UFC opponents. She was definitely a lot smaller than Joanne Calderwood, and she was much smaller than Courtney Casey. She's fought two of the larger female flyweights or strawweights, but she is definitely an atom weight. And Beck Rawlings is pretty big, and she's aggressive, and she likes the clinch. And not only is Ham is, I think, 4 inches shorter than Rawlings and noticeably slighter of frame. So I think that there is a chance that Rawlings outmuscles her and maybe outworks her a bit on the ground. But I think Ham's pretty good in scrambles. I think she's difficult to take down in part because of her stature, because she's so small. She's got that Mark Hunt thing going on without the gut. And I think she probably is just smart enough and tough enough to outlast Rawlings and find her openings as the fight progresses.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it, though. This is one of the highlights in the card for me. I think it can't help but be fun. There's not been a Siohi Ham fight in the UFC so far that has not been enjoyable, and Beck Rawlings is always in crazy fights, so should be entertaining. What's next? What's next for us?
Johnny Case versus Jake Matthews, I think we wanted to talk about.
Why don't you take the lead with this one?
Bizarre matchmaking.
Yeah.
Strange matchmaking.
Yeah.
Like, you would think that you want to build Matthews, who's only 21 years old. I think after he struggled a little bit against Akbar Ariola, you want to build him a little bit more slowly, especially because he lost to James Vick in the fight before that, got caught with a guillotine. Matthews has a ton of talent. He's a great athlete, great physical specimen, big, strong, fast, hits real hard, has power in both hands, great instincts in transition, really nice top game. But he's pretty one note as a striker, and once guys figure out his speed and his power, once they felt his speed and once they felt his power, he doesn't have a whole lot of technical depth to fall back on. Same deal with his wrestling game. Now, Johnny Case, by contrast, is really experienced. He's a very good fighter. He's got a lot of depth of skill in pretty much everything that he does. And he can match Matthews' size. He's a pretty good athlete, too. I think he's not quite as athletic, but a good athlete. He's got power. He's just a nightmarish matchup for a physically gifted but still relatively technically limited prospect. Like, I don't understand why you'd make the fight.
Yeah, I agree. Jake Matthews, I think figuring out his speed and timing is the one thing. Here is a guy who because he's young, and like a lot of young talented fighters do, he really has learned to rely for the time while he is still learning filling in the technical gaps. He has learned to rely on his speed, and so because of that, everything comes at top speed. everything even though top speed sounds dangerous, at a point it becomes predictable. And when opponents in the past have figured out his speed, that's when they have given him trouble. And he does not have he's one of those fighters who's at great risk of running out of ideas as a fight progresses, because he just doesn't have a lot of depth and a lot of nuance to fall back on. So I think Johnny Case beats him. It's one of the UFC's many cases of baffling matchmaking where this kind of combines both of the weird matchmaking habits of the UFC's matchmakers, where they have a local fighter that they have set up to lose, because they love to do that, the Poland card being probably the most notable example in recent memory, and also where they have a hot prospect who they foolishly throw against a very experienced journeyman. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I don't know what the thought process is here. Hopefully it doesn't destroy Jake Matthews as a prospect, because God knows Australia would desperately like to have a good prospect, and he does have potential. I'd like to see him progress. We'll see. He seems pretty tough. He came back from the James Vick fight okay, so who knows?
Yeah. So weird fight, but weird matchmaking. I think Case probably takes it, but it wouldn't at all be surprising if Matthews just came out looking like massively improved, given that he's 21.
Sure. Yeah,
and I don't think that would surprise any of us.
And both of his last two fights have been valuable learning experiences. He may have changed some things up and improved. You can't ever put the ability of a young fighter like that to improve. You can't ever ignore that to rapidly improve from one fight to the next. But it is what it is. Next up, we got Neil Magny, Hector Lombard. We'll try and run through these last two pretty quickly. You are pretty confident that Neil Magny wins this fight.
Yeah, I really am. I have no confidence in the 38-year-old version of Hector Lombard coming off a PED suspension under new USADA testing, who never had great cardio, fighting a cardio machine, even if that cardio machine really likes the clinch, and Lombard is a judo Olympian. I think that, Magny has a 6-inch height advantage. He's got a 9-inch reach advantage. He's got cardio for days. And Lombard is going to have to push Magny back to the fence. I don't think he can get much of anything done in open space. And Lombard has never had good pressure footwork. He relies on guys backing themselves up to the fence. And I think that Magny, a smart fighter who's had a whole camp to prepare for this, is just not going to do that.
You don't think Magny's going to back himself into the fence?
I do not think that Magny's going to do that, no. And that may be the single flawed assumption that I have.
See, these are my fears right there. I do think Magny wins this fight. I think he deserves to be favored. But there are a few things that just give me pause. Magny's hittable. We always say height advantage, but there are great risks to being that much taller than your opponents. If you watch Steve Cunningham versus Tyson Fury, you get a really nice example of those risks around the 4th or the 5th round, I think. The overhands, when you're that tall, it's very difficult to get your head out of the way without leaning back. And if you misjudge the distance and get caught while you're leaning back, you're going to get hurt even more than if you just got caught flush standing straight up. So that's a risk. And we know Lombard hits hard. We know he covers distance quickly, maybe lessened after the PED suspension. We'll see. But that's a risk right there. I think Magny has gotten himself back in the fence. I don't think he's as great a long fighter as he should be. I think he's better in the clinch and inside and on the ground. He has really, really progressed as a top game. Like that, I think, is his real strong suit, is his top game. And I'm just not confident that he can easily get Hector Lombard down, definitely not in the first round, or that he can deal with him in the clinch. The one fight that really gives me pause here regarding this is, Hector Lombard against Jake Shields. I know Jake Shields is a kind of a joke to a lot of people, but Jake Shields is definitely the 3rd best welterweight of all time. I think so. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that.
After GSP and Matt Hughes, who else is there? I mean, Jake Shields is a beast.
I think that there's a better argument for Jake Shields as the number 2 welterweight than there is for Matt
Hughes.
Sure, okay. Come at me.
So he's definitely a top 3 welterweight of all time. Definitely a top 5. He's very, very good, and very tricky, and very good fighters have struggled to put him off when it comes to his weird wrestling and clinch game. Fighters as good as Damian Maia,
Dan
Henderson, Tyron Woodley, George St. Pierre had a few difficulties, Yoshihiro Akiyama. Fighters with good defensive wrestling have not always, Robbie Lawler, fighters that are good at stopping takedowns and fighting off the clinch have not always succeeded. Hector Lombard toyed with Jake Shields in the clinch. It easily is one of his best wins, the Jake Shields win. if not his best win. And so,
yeah, I think it's his single best win.
Sure. So, granted, we don't know how well he does that off of the PEDs and everything, but those things give me pause. So to me, it feels like one of those fights where Neil Magny definitely does not win the first round. I would pick Neil Magny so confidently if it were a 5-rounder. But I think if Hector has just enough in the tank to have a good second round, that he could win this fight. So I like Magny too, but it's a tougher call for me.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you there. So main event, I think Hunt melts Frank Mir. But
saying that is going to make Frank Mir win. Like anytime you're confident that Frank Mir is going to get destroyed, anytime the chances of Frank Mir destroying his opponent in embarrassing fashion go up vastly. And I think for a long time, the most underrated aspect of Frank Mir's game has been his boxing. He's not a bad boxer. Not by any means.
He's not a bad boxer, but he's a very hittable boxer.
He is, absolutely. Although, given the Todd Duffy fight, he looked improved in that regard. Defense was much better in that fight.
It was much better, but it was better against Todd Duffy.
Yes, that's very true.
And it really, I mean, yeah, so I'm with all of that. Like, Mark Hunt's chin is cracked. Mark Hunt is getting up there in years. But if Mark Hunt gets beaten on the feet by Frank Mir, then he needs to find another job. I mean that seriously.
Yeah,
like this is. And the bigger problem for Mir in this fight, I don't think is his boxing. I think it's can he take Hunt down? And I think the answer to that question is no.
Oh, definitely.
We've seen better takedown artists than Frank Mir try and fail to take Mark Hunt down.
When's the last time Frank Mir took anyone down? I think it's been a while. Frank Mir has not been a successful takedown artist for some time. I think he's probably had more knockdowns in the past 5 years than he has takedowns.
Yeah, I'm going to look this up because I'm genuinely curious about this. He took down Alistair Overeem. He took down Arlovsky in the last fight.
Okay.
And he took down Overeem very briefly. He took down Big Nog when they fought.
Okay, he took Nelson down. Okay, so I overstated there, but still, not a great takedown artist, Frank Mir. Not a great wrestler in general. Not a great cage craftsman when it comes to moving around the cage of the ring. But still, you just can't... I just can't confidently write Frank Mir off. I think Mark Hunt melts him too, but I always get scared when a favorite heavyweight fights Frank Mir. And I think for good reason, because he has proven time and time again he is the man who just will not go away.
Yeah, this is true. I can't disagree with any of that.
He's the contender who will not die. So that's it. That's the fight smorgasbord of the week. We hope you guys enjoyed that one. I'm looking forward to this fight card. I don't know that I'll get a chance to watch it live, but I think it should be fun. I think it'll be an ideal DVR card to just skip through the commercials and skip through fights that seem boring and go on to the ones you really want to see. There's a lot of fun matchups on here that just don't, that would be like fantastic filler material for a stronger pay-per-view kind of card,
Yeah, I'm with that.
It is what it is. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed all of our discussion today about fight camps. This has been Heavy Hands, so on and so forth. Let's give a few plugs before we wrap up. Actually, Pat, do you have anything of note coming out this week?
Just my usual preview, and then I'm doing a little piece on how Nate Diaz has become a money-weight fighter.
Oh, nice. That sounds interesting. I've got the Sherdog preview as well. I think Phil McKenzie and I will be doing another installment in the League of Extraordinary Journeymen about the two middleweight fights on this card and spending a lot of time recapping our the last card we discussed, which was Silva Bisping. So we'll have a few interesting thoughts there. And I still want to do a follow-up to my Puncher's Path piece with Conor McGregor, so I'm going to try and get that out at some point this week, even though it's a while after that fight now. And we'll see what else. Who knows? But that's how it is. So, really trailing here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you came here for the finer points of face punching and also don't want to talk about Ren Nakai, you came to the right place, because this has been Heavy Hands.